Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chapter 5 lecture for Crowley's An Introduction to Human Disease. This chapter is all about inflammation and repair. So inflammation stems from the immune system. So this chapter is really kind of an introduction to the first part of the immune system. So really there's actually sort of three parts of the immune system, three lines of defense. The immune system is the body system that's charged with defending the body from invaders, both physical and biological. So the innate immune system is called innate because it's the immune system that we are born with. All right. The first line of defense, technically not really part of the immune system. This is physical barriers. So things like your skin and mucus production. So we don't typically consider the skin an immune organ. All right. Physical barriers are physical defenses. The cellular layers of defense, the cells that are specifically involved in defending our bodies from invaders, that's really where what we refer to as the immune system, and that is our second and third lines of defense. So I won't really get into those physical and chemical barriers. They're there. We'll discuss them in the different body systems. And for now, we're going to focus, this chapter is really going to be focused on discussing inflammation and phagocytosis. These are sort of the key features of the innate immunity, and what's also called our second line of defense. All right, and we will talk about the various white blood cells that are important for doing phagocytosis and the process of inflammation. So white blood cells and red blood cells, all of our blood cells, come from our bones, our bone marrow. Bone marrow is found really in the long bones of the body. There are stem cells there called hematopoietic stem cells. Hematopoiesis is a big fancy medical term for the formation of blood. And so hematopoietic stem cells are stem cells that can differentiate into any type of blood cell. Red blood cells, platelets, which are technically not cells themselves, they are fragments of a large cell called a megakaryocyte. So they're little fragments that help with blood clotting. And then the various lineages of white blood cells. So all of the cells in this yellow box here are various types of white blood cells. And there's actually more than that, more subcategories. But we won't get into those at this level. That's for an immunology course. So in this chapter, we're going to be focusing on these cells here, largely the neutrophils and the macrophages. They are involved in innate immunity. And then these cells over here, the lymphocytes, are the ones that are going to be in the next chapter when we're talking about the adaptive immune response. Okay, so let's talk about inflammation. There are 5 classic signs of inflammation, and these should be familiar to you if you've ever gotten a cut or an infection. Heat, redness, swelling, tenderness, and pain are these classic signs. And all of these signs are due to chemicals that are produced by either the injured cells in your body or immune cells in your body. And this is a neat sort of infographic to kind of show you all the different things that are happening to give rise to these signs. So the heat and redness is due to increased blood flow to the area. That's due to certain chemicals that are released that cause vasodilation or blood vessel widening. Then the blood vessels, when they widen, they also get the gaps between the cells get wider, so they become a little bit leaky. So fluids and also white blood cells can start to move out of the tissue. We call that out of the blood and into the tissue. That's called extravasation, and that leads to the swelling and some of the tenderness. Um, and also, those white blood cells and the injured cells themselves are releasing various chemicals called cytokines that are contributing to the production of molecules that are sensed by your pain receptors and so that you feel pain. Any type of inflammation or inflammatory condition, you'll see in the medicalese, medical language, that it ends in these four letters, I-T-I-S, itis. So itis is a medical suffix that means inflammation or infection. So pretty much any part of the body you can think of, we can add itis to the end, and that means inflammation. So that's why there's a lot of medical conditions with the suffix itis, because basically anything that is infected or injured can become inflamed. Inflammation is a major feature of disease. So I mentioned that injured cells and white blood cells can release these various chemical mediators. And they come in a variety of categories. Generally, I will just refer to them all as cytokines, though they technically have different categories. So the cytokines tend to be molecules that help to activate white blood cells or attract white blood cells to the scene. Some of these cytokines, like histamine, is an important one that leads to vasodilation, and this one is released by mast cells and injured in the injured tissue. And it's a really good recruiter of other white blood cells to the scene. Prostaglandins, another good one to know, is these form molecules that trigger your pain receptors to feel pain. A lot of anti-inflammatories that we'll talk about, a lot of over-the-counter NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, are prostaglandin inhibitors. That's how they reduce pain. There are a variety of different cytokines, way more than are listed here. These are just ones that are key and listed in the textbook. And all the ones listed here are really, they are inflammatory chemical mediators. But there's also anti-inflammatory chemical mediators too that are released after the inflammatory event is over to help kind of calm everything down. In general, in our bodies, homeostasis, a sense sort of establishing a state of balance and baseline, is very important in all body systems. And these different pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory mediators have to work in concert to keep things balanced, because inflammation is good if you have an infection or an injury that needs tending to. But when that infection or injury is healed, you need that inflammation to come back down, because otherwise it'll just continue to damage tissues, and that's chronic inflammation, and we'll talk about the problem with that. So acute inflammation is the inflammation that happens immediately. Acute is a medical term that means sort of pretty severe and rapid onset. So if you got injured by maybe getting stuck by a pin, all right, that pin from the environment will contain bacteria. Also, maybe bacteria from the outside of your skin get pushed in. It also tears apart tissue. All right, and so those damaged cells, as well as white blood cells within this tissue, the specialized cells called mast cells, will start releasing chemical signals, namely histamine. All right, histamine will then cause the blood vessels to dilate. The next step is vasodilation and chemotaxis. So these dilated blood vessels bring more blood, and that includes white blood cells, to the site. And those white blood cells are attracted to the site by some of these different cytokines that are being secreted that tell the white blood cells the injury is here, come here, like, you know, like a fire alarm or something attracting a fire truck. The white blood cells leave the blood vessels. Also, some fluid from the blood vessels will leak into the tissue too, which you can see results in swelling of that tissue. Also, this is when platelets and stuff will be released to help cause blood clotting. If it's bleeding, there's different types of fluids that can move into the tissue. When fluids move into the tissue, that's called extravasation. And if it's just like proteinous albumin fluid from the blood, it's called serous extravasation. That happens a lot of times in acne, like formation of cysts where they're just sort of oil-filled, fluid-filled. Purulent is a medical term for pussy. And pus is actually dead white blood cells, specifically neutrophils. And so all of these white blood cells, particularly neutrophils that are leaving and entering the tissue, they will do phagocytosis. They will eat bacteria, they'll eat dead and damaged tissue, and then they die there. And so they can contribute to that pus. And other types, hemorrhagic, would be blood-filled swelling due to blood. You see this in like blood blisters. If you've ever had like a blood blister, where it fills with blood. So there's different types of fluids that can contribute to swelling. All of those types of swelling are known as edema. Edema is the medical term for swelling. So when these white blood cells move into the tissue, their job is phagocytosis, which is a term that literally means eating cells. Their job is to eat debris, including bacteria or viruses that are in the tissue, to prevent them from leading to an infection and help cleaning up. There's also cytokines that are being, like various chemicals that trigger the healing process and regrowth of cells during this phase. So a little bit about phagocytosis. It does mean cell eating, and white blood cells can eat other cells, and then in that phagolysosome they can kill the microbes by a combination of lysosomal enzymes. So these are lysosomes with granules in them that are just enzyme packets that fuse here, so you have this phagolysosome. But also what you see happening here is some chemical reactions that lead to the production of two types of reactive oxygen species. The first is H2O2, which is hydrogen peroxide, and the second is hypochlorite, HOCl. It's the active ingredient in bleach. So we know that hydrogen peroxide and bleach are excellent decontamination agents. We also know that they are toxic to us as humans. We would not want to consume them, but they are used in very small controlled amounts within our cells because, again, of their powerful sterilizing ability. So also in acute inflammation, so what we have in this slide here is we're talking about what's happening locally in the tissue at the site of injury or the site of infection. But more systemically throughout the body, these cytokines that are being made by white blood cells like macrophages and neutrophils and mast cells, these are the important cells of the innate immune system. All right, they are secreting lots and lots of cytokines that go through the bloodstream. This is a type of endocrine communication where cells in one place are secreting a chemical that are then flowing through the bloodstream to other places to signal other tissues. They can signal the hypothalamus, which controls body temperature and induce a fever. It can trigger the liver to start producing several enzymes that are signs of inflammation, like fibrinogen, which is important for blood clotting, and C-reactive protein, amongst others. It can also trigger the hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow to start making more white blood cells to replace ones that are lost, but also more to fight whatever infection or help with the injury. So to upregulate white blood cells. We can test for all of these things as well. All of these different effects, systemic effects of acute inflammation, are measurable by various diagnostic techniques. You can measure fever using a thermometer to take temperature. You can measure fibrinogen by doing an erythrocyte sedimentation assay. Erythrocyte is a medical term for red blood cells. It's more commonly referred to as a sed rate, measuring somebody's sed rate or sedimentation rate, and that's of their blood. Sort of just measures how fast it clots. And then C-reactive protein, there are tests to measure the amounts of CRP in the blood. These are blood tests. And another blood test that you can do is a CBC, which stands for a complete blood count, where it counts the total proportions of all the different types of white blood cells in your blood to determine whether they are sort of normal baseline levels or if they are elevated or increased. Whoops. So what we've been talking about so far is acute inflammation, that inflammation that happens immediately upon injury, whether it's injury from trauma, cuts, frostbite, chemical irritants, infection, etc. Right? The idea is that the immune system causes inflammation to help protect us during that trauma, but then the inflammation ideally comes down and does not go on to produce chronic inflammation. So chronic inflammation can happen though if you have a chronic infection or if there is some internal source of trauma that's not being effectively treated, or even external sources of trauma like injury from exercise. All right, these types of chronic inflammation can lead to detrimental health side effects and cause various chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, arthritis, autoimmune diseases, neurological diseases like dementia, and famously cancer. Inflammation is a precursor for a lot of cancers. For example, if somebody has a stomach ulcer, stomach ulcers increase your risk for stomach cancer if you don't treat them, because the chronic inflammation can damage cells and mutate them, essentially causing them to become cancerous. So it's important to treat inflammation in the acute stage and prevent it from becoming chronic inflammation to prevent these other diseases. So ideally, after inflammation is over, when inflammation resolves, you are left with scar tissue. So here's an example with the skin where there's a cut and the white blood cells come in like the macrophages and the neutrophils, and then there's a proliferation stage after the inflammation is over. The fibroblasts in the skin tissue repopulate, they proliferate in order to repopulate and form and do some remodeling in order to form new skin cells. Now the new tissue, the scar tissue that's formed, is more fibrous. You can see this sort of pink knot here. That is additional fibers. All right, so scar tissue is not quite the same as normal tissue. And for occasional scars, that's fine, that's great, the body can deal with that. But for some organs, if the scar tissue builds up too much, it really impairs the function of the organ. So for example, in the liver is actually a very regenerative organ, but chronically damaging the liver can cause fibrosis. So basically fibrous scar tissue all over the liver that impairs its function and causes chronic liver disease. Treatments for inflammation can be over-the-counter. These are our NSAIDs. It stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And these are going to be aspirin, naproxen, which usually the brand name is Aleve, but there's off-brand naproxen as well, and ibuprofen. Brand names you're familiar with would be Advil and Motrin. These are anti-inflammatory, so they reduce inflammation, they reduce pain, they're analgesics, And they also reduce fevers. They are antipyretics, and they do this by blocking some of those cytokines that are produced, or blocking production of cytokines like prostaglandins, which contribute to pain, and pyrogens, which contribute to fever. If you need a higher level of anti-inflammatory treatment, you can take corticosteroids. Corticosteroids are derived from natural steroids that are made by the cortex of the kidney, the renal cortex. So your body makes a bunch of anti-inflammatory molecules. We talked about the balance between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. So these are very similar to the natural compounds your body makes. But again, you want to be very careful about the balance, and so corticosteroids, they have a stronger effect, and they also have potential side effects, so those are prescribed. They have to be prescribed and used under the surveillance of a doctor. Another thing that I added in here for injuries, particularly to the skin, but even in organs as well, sometimes suturing is a physical method that can aid in the healing process. So for example, if you have a laceration, a cut, and you can't see my cursor, there we go. If you have a laceration or a cut and you don't suture it, okay, there's more, you need to have more epithelial cells form, and you get this thicker, more fibrous scar, versus using sutures to bring the skin cells together, so fewer cells need to be made to bridge the gap, and you get a smaller scar and you get faster healing. Now sometimes if there's potential for, if the wound is infected and it needs to sort of like air out or be treated with antibiotics, there are scenarios where doctors choose to have scars heal this way versus this way. But certainly suturing or physically closing a scar site can help it to heal faster because it less space to fill with new cells. And that is the end of chapter 5. Thank you.